Hello, in this video, I want to tell you if I agree with Metatron's take on communism. He's actually reacting to another video that is quite controversial, so I'll first let Metatron speak, and then I will tell you my take on the situation.
Noble ones. At this point, I'm waiting for an expert to tell us Genghis Khan wasn't evil because he allowed religious freedom, so as you can see, evil is mentioned. And here we see one of the two things that she said in that section that caused so much backlash they had to cut it out. It wasn't more evil than any other country. That is exactly what she said as one of the things. So she's reading the question, was the Soviet Union evil? And she says it wasn't more evil than any other country. And then the next question is about the gulags and the millions of people that were, so yeah, it's getting people really upset. The second thing she said is this: the Soviet Union wasn't more evil than the US. She absolutely stated this. So she is literally comparing a totalitarian regime under Stalin specifically. Stalin. And she's saying, well, it's not more evil than the West and the US. Now, what's really insane about this statement is the fact that it's coming from a historian. If you ask me as a person, then I would tell you that all totalitarian regimes were evil. Austrian painter was evil. Mussolini was evil, Stalin was objectively evil. Just look at the millions of casualties. With that being said, I would also tell the audience or the person asking me that if I have to respond as a historian, evil and good are usually not used in academia as a way to describe both historical events and forms of government and totalitarian regimes and historical people, simply because emotions come into play when you do that and you want to try and kind of stick to the cold facts.
Okay, so let me first start with a point of agreement. So I agree that democracy is better than dictatorship. Definitely, generally speaking, maybe we can find some weird exception where it was actually better to live under a dictatorship than under a democracy. But okay, so there are two ways of analyzing this idea that the Soviet Union was just as evil as the West. One is to say that you are trying to whitewash Stalin's crimes and the gulags. But there are also two other options. Perhaps the woman that Metatron is responding to was talking about foreign policy, and in their foreign policy, I really do think that both the Soviet Union and the West and the United States were equally imperialistic. Let me explain why. So if you focus on Eastern Europe, then the Soviet Union are the bad guys. The United States actually helped save Eastern Europe from oppression, from the Soviet Union oppressing them. But if you focus on various other countries like Cuba, like Venezuela, Guatemala, Chile, then the United States is the bad guys. Why? Because they pretty much brought fascist dictators to power in many of those countries. And then there was a revolution against them. Yeah, so for example, Pinochet. The guy never would have destroyed democracy in Chile without the help of the United States that was, well, quite openly betraying their ideals in supporting Pinochet, because Allende, while he was a communist, he was a democratically elected communist. That's the problem. So the United States, in their foreign policy, went against democracy. And if the woman was trying to say that, well, okay, then I would agree, but that's why we have to be more precise. Had she just said that the West was equally evil in their foreign policy, I would actually agree. But this way, it sounds like she's kind of justifying the gulags, the Holodomor, the most horrible stuff that Stalin did, which no sane person should do. I mean, we can analyze why that happened. We can compare it with Hitler, and I still think that Hitler was worse than Stalin. Why is that? Well, I'll make a video about it, but yeah, so we should be very specific. Are we talking about foreign policy or about internal policy? And these two people, Metatron and the professor, they might be talking past each other. that might be the source of their disagreement. But okay, let us continue.
So I see she's already got a little flag with the hammer and sickle. That's very appropriate. Stalin would be proud.
The next question. Was the Soviet Union communist? This is actually more of a complicated answer than people would think. Ideologues in the Soviet Union would not consider themselves or not consider the state to be communist. Attaining communism was a continual process in the minds of Soviet ideologues. They saw Russia as having began its foundation as a feudal state, then kind of moved up to capitalism, albeit very briefly. Then during its existence, the Soviet Union was imagined as being in a socialist state, right? That's how you have Soviet socialist republics. You don't have, Soviet communist republics. There were a lot of discussions amongst members of the Central Committee about how to continually evolve into this ideal communist state. So from that perspective, you could argue that the Soviet Union was never communist throughout its entire existence. It was constantly building up to that point. That's not to say...
Okay, did you finish? Because I don't want to interrupt.
This is...
Okay, so this is a very easy answer. Yes, they were communists. So that's what we are doing, is it? All right, so let me comment on this. I would like to premise, before I say anything, interject, apart from the jokes, before I present my ideas, I do want to underline the fact that I am no expert on this field. This is a little bit outside my field of expertise. And also, unfortunately, I don't have a team member with my researchers and academics that is specialized in this area. Therefore, my words cannot be peer-reviewed for this video, which basically means do take whatever I say with a pinch of salt. I'm telling you that for intellectual honesty, although then again, even when it comes to people who are specialists on any field, still double check whatever they say and use your own critical thinking. With that being said, what this appears to me is something that academics tend to do when they have an agenda. I still don't know if she has an agenda, I'm just saying what it appears to be. Because it's what is called a manipulation. Really using semantics. She's saying, well, they had this idea of communism as it would have functioned or should function, and because they didn't actually attain that exactly, then we can't really say that they were 100% communists. No, they were communists. Because if that were the case, then we could apply the same concept to the fascists. Benito Mussolini's idea of basing his fascist state and regime upon the recreation of the ancient Roman Empire was never attained how he wanted. It didn't even get close. Can we then use the same and apply the same logic to say, well then, were they really fascist? Not exactly.
Okay, let me comment on this. This is an interesting question. So, again, they might just be speaking past each other, because Archie Brown, in his book Rise and Fall of Communism, defines communism in two ways, and he's one of the most respected historians on the topic. So he says communism has two meanings. One, utopian communism, perhaps never reached anywhere. Some would say on the kibbutz farms that it was reached in Israel. But the other meaning is what Metatron is speaking about. Other meaning of the word communism is one-party totalitarian systems under the rule of the communist government that implement a planned economy, kill the political opposition and stuff like that. So those are the two definitions. Both of them we can call communism. So she's speaking about utopian communism, and Metatron is speaking about real world communism. But okay, now Metatron makes the case, well, the fascists also never achieved their ideals. Can we then apply the same, let's say, justification to fascism? Although, honestly, I wouldn't even say that, like saying that's not true communism. That's not a justification, in my opinion. Why not? Because then it just begs the question, why is it that almost every time we tried communism, it resulted in something that wasn't communism? But okay. But yeah, other than that, the only meaningful difference between Mussolini's ideal state and what he achieved was the fact that his state was smaller. That's the difference between communism and fascism. Communism was supposed to result in a stateless society. But okay, let us continue.
The Soviet Union hate the United States. There wasn't so much hate as there was maybe perhaps more fascination.
On what planet? Seriously? Oh gosh. Oh yeah, the USSR, Stalin, they all loved the US. They were like, wow, I really wish I could get a nice steak and sweet tea. Sweet tea. Love the US.
People were curious to know what life was like in the West, not only in the United States. The evil, the hate, and these kinds of words come out of Cold War discourse that was very sort of polarizing and intended to be polarizing. But in reality, if you look at accounts from the Soviet Union, especially in the 60s and 70s, we know that there was a lot of interest in material culture and culture coming from the West. They were curious in reading what was being published in the West. They were interested in hearing music that was being played in the West.
I'm curious to understand what she means by they, and I think they needs to be specifically underlined, Professor, before you continue with your presentation and discuss the information, because I think that makes it confusing now. Who's they? The general population? The authorities? The politicians? Who are you talking about? The army? Members of KGB? Like, who are you talking about? Because normally when people ask, why did Russia or why did the USSR hate the US? If you talk about the politicians, yeah, they did. But when you talk about the everyday Russian, they don't represent. I mean, the politicians, even though that's the way we see it, they don't really represent them, particularly considering the fact that the Bolshevik came to power by force. So that's another.
So here is my take on the situation. Yes, she should have been more specific. But the reality is, first of all, it depends on what period we're talking about. Stalin surely hated the United States. Although, again, in 1942, he kind of liked the fact that they are fighting against Hitler. Then, after the war, he really began to hate the United States, and he was even convinced that the United States are hiding Hitler. That's how crazy he was, and he believed that they will bring Hitler back to power in West Germany, and that then Hitler will attack the Soviets again. That's what he thought might happen. But then again, were some American generals equally paranoid? For example, some American generals expected China to invade Berlin, like West Berlin. Yeah, they expected Chinese paratroopers over West Berlin. So, yeah, my point is, on both sides of the spectrum, we have a lot of irrational hatred. We also have rational, what I would call rational hatred. Now, like, definitely aspects of the Soviet Union should be strongly condemned. But in the same way, the Soviet Union had realistic fears. So they remembered that they were invaded once during the Civil War by the Western powers. So it's not like the West was super pacifist at the time, that they never invaded like smaller countries or colonized them. But yeah, I mean, some Soviet elites definitely did not hate the West. So Gorbachev, definitely, he was fascinated by the West and even tried to imitate it in a way. Khrushchev is also an interesting example. So of course he saw the West as his geopolitical rival. He wanted to outdo the West. But he did not hate the West in the same way in which, for example, Stalin hated the West, nor in the same way in which, for example, Hitler and Stalin hated each other. So for Khrushchev, it was more about, let us prove to the Americans that we are better than them in, for example, conquering space before them, in having more scientific discoveries, in spreading our influence more. But Khrushchev never thought about attacking the United States. And he even respected Kennedy, John F. Kennedy. He actually admired Kennedy's speech about how there needs to be peace in the world, and he was inspired by that speech after the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which Kennedy actually made a very significant point, and that is that the Soviet Union and the United States, despite not being friends, did not go to war with each other. And that was a big deal, especially if you look at the 20th century from their perspective, from the perspective of Kennedy and Khrushchev. So there is the First World War, then there is the Second World War, and then some expected the Third World War to break out immediately after. But that didn't happen. We were close, but that didn't happen. And that was an improvement, one could say. Okay, but let us continue.
Was the Soviet Union poor? Again, it depends on what we mean by poor. Certainly, a lot of images circulated in the West with people waiting in lines to get food with ration cards. So in the West, there was this image that people in the Soviet Union were poor. But in reality, it was not necessarily the case. One could argue that the Soviet Union offered employment officially to every person residing in the Soviet Union. One could argue that perhaps being less
Offered employment to every single person sounds impossible. Again, not the expert.
Materialist.
Okay, here I'm going to end the video after this segment because it's already getting very long. But okay, then luckily for us, I read a lot about communism. My final thesis in university was about communism. So yes, the professor actually is right. According to Archie Brown, the Soviet Union did offer employment to all citizens. I mean, one could say even to those in the Gulag, although that was more like slavery. But yeah, Stalin did have full employment. And many have used it as a pro-communist argument, like while capitalist countries like the Weimar Republic had 40% unemployment during the 1930s, the Soviets had full employment. But okay, the obvious counter-argument is it wasn't good employment. Like, it's not like everybody was doing what they wanted to do. Like, it wasn't a job of their dreams. It wasn't well paid, even, often. So that's why, for example, the Soviets had bad agriculture. Well, one of the reasons was they were underpaying the peasants that were paid by the state. And that was a problem. So yeah, that's an obvious counter-argument. I mean, I do realize that to some people, like Metatron, it kind of sounds fake, but it isn't. Like, the communist countries just had a different way of thinking. Their priority was making sure that everybody is employed, but that makes the economy less profitable in the long run. But it turns out to them it wasn't always a priority to produce more profit, although at certain time periods it was. But yeah, I mean, look, I often like to joke when somebody tells me like Elon Musk created millions of jobs. I like to say as a joke, Stalin created more. And the point of the joke is that not every job is a good job. Like, is just creating jobs good? Well, yeah, kind of it is. Like, on an intuitive level, having a job is better than not having a job, obviously. But yeah, the point is, it wasn't a good job. Like, it's not like everybody had a good job. That's the point. But okay, I really think that we should end the video here. And actually, let me end on a note. Let me end with a general point. How would I describe communism generally? One way of looking at communism is to, okay, compare it with other liberal countries. That is what Metatron is doing. The other is to compare it with the Russian Empire and then see what was better. And I like maybe more to do the second approach. So compared to the Russian Empire, communism was actually quite progressive. In what aspects? Well, Lenin recognized many minorities as separate nations. For example, the Ukrainians. And Putin even said in an interview that that was a huge mistake and that without it Russia would still be this great empire. And what's kind of sad about it is that Lenin was actually more progressive than Putin, a 21st century man. Yeah, in some aspects at least. When it comes to like minorities, when it comes to the fact that Ukrainians and many other nations exist as nations and should be recognized as such. But okay, don't forget to like, share and subscribe if you liked this video.